Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at triathletics.com. We got a question asking, what is the ideal stride length for a pitcher? So that's what I want to dig into a little bit today, give you my take on the topic, and kind of decode again. We hear all the time coming up, like a longer stride is always better, but then you see pitchers pitch on TV where they have a little bit of a shorter stride sometimes. Zach Greinke comes to mind as one. And so again, it can be a little bit confusing of a topic at times. So again, what are we talking about when we talk about stride length? Just to define how we're going to use it here, some people measure from the rubber to the toe, some people measure from the rubber to the heel. The research that we're going to be citing here looks at measuring from the rubber to the ankle. So we're going to be using that as kind of a gauge. So again, the numbers will inflate or deflate depending on how you exactly measure stride length. If you see a number like 120% of stride length, I've seen that reference with like Chapman or Tim Lincecum. They're measuring to the toe, most likely. Those guys do not have stride lengths nearly that long if you actually measure to the heel or to the ankle. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about stride length, just for your reference point. What exactly is the purpose of the stride? Let's just create that context first. So when we talk about the stride, we need to understand where the stride fits in the context of the overall lower half mechanics and the overall delivery. So there's really three, you can argue four parts to the lower half. The first is the initial weight shift or the drift. That's basically your leg lift phase. That's what gets your momentum going forward. That's what shifts your center of mass away from the rubber. That's the drift phase. Phase two, that's where the stride comes in. That's the hinge, the drop, the linear move phase. That's when you take that forward move, drop into your back leg, and ride it in a linear fashion down the mound. So what comes after that? There's the rotation phase. That's when you actually take that linear move and you rotate out of it into landing. That's a very short phase. And then there's, you can argue, the blocking phase is the fourth phase of the lower half, and that's when the lead leg accepts that force and allows that to be transmitted up the chain. So why is this important? Well, it's important because the stride or the linear move sets up the rotation, which sets up the blocking phase. So we need to understand that very carefully, because a longer stride, as we'll talk about in a second, is not necessarily better if it doesn't properly set up the rotation phase and the blocking phase. So if you're not able to effectively rotate out of your stride, you're not going to be able to effectively block. And again, that stride can then become actual detriment to your pitching mechanics, to your mechanical efficiency. So just as a broad look at the purpose of the stride, it's to capture that energy from the drift, it's to give you that linear momentum, and then it's to be able to actually transfer that linear momentum into rotation, which ultimately is blocked by the lead leg and fed its way up the chain like a tornado into the upper half, into the arm. So it's important to understand here that when we talk about pitching, we're really talking about combining both linear and rotational elements. So the most efficient throwers in the world, most efficient pitchers in the world, they're able to take the linear portion of the throw, the stride phase, and they're able to convert that into rotation. So there has to be a blend of both, right? You can't just have a linear component to the throw where you're just jumping off the mound, blocking, and there's never actually rotation. And you can't just purely have a rotational throw where there's no actual linear component. You can, but neither of those are the optimal movement strategies to throw 95 plus miles an hour. So we think of it from that context. We're combining the linear with the rotational, and we can think of it on a spectrum. We need to have an ideal blend of both. So what are the general factors that contribute to stride length? Well, the first obvious one is height. If you're taller, if you have longer legs, then you just taking a stride 60-70% of your height is going to be a longer stride, all else equal. So taller pitchers will have greater stride lengths, greater extension. This is why the research looks at stride length as a percentage of your height. So if you can standardize it based on percentage, that's really what we're talking about, percentage of height, later on in the video. The second component is mobility. So as you stride, you're starting to get into relatively deep positions on the back leg. So mobility can be an issue, specifically in the groin, specifically in some of the deep hip rotator muscles in kind of your lateral hip and kind of your medial hip as well. So we can think about abduction, internal rotation, and hip extension. Any of those muscles throughout your hip flexor, groin, and hip rotators, if those are super tight, super wound up, those can be a limiting factor into stride length as well. Next, intensity, an obvious factor. Guys that are warming up to throw 50, 60, 70%, typically shorter strides, that stride length will get longer as the propulsive forces, as the ground reaction forces into the rubber tend to go up. So guys in cleats on a dirt mound throwing at max effort, typically going to have a longer stride than that same exact athlete warming up at 50% on an indoor mound. Next factor, and probably the most important factor that we can talk about here, is the actual pelvic loading strategy. How do they actually utilize their backside, their lower half when they throw? So are they a guy who just jumps off the mound, extends through their quad, extends through the hip as their loading strategy? Right, that's a pretty linear loading strategy. There's really no rotation happening. We'll talk more about that. Or are they a guy who maybe pops out of their lower half early? They're very rotational, but they don't actually stay into a sustained linear move very long. So what is their pelvic loading strategy? How long do they hold that stride? Do they hold that tension and that position, that stacked position over the back hip? That's something we talk about all the time. So pelvic loading strategy being one of the other main factors. So revisiting the original question, what is the ideal stride length? There's really an ideal range for each individual athlete. There's such a thing as too short, there's such a thing as too long, but I refer to this as kind of the Goldilocks zone, where for that specific athlete, given their height, given their mobility, given how they utilize the lower half, there's kind of an ideal range for them where that stride length begins to settle in. So why is too short of a stride a problem? Well, let's exaggerate it. Let's take a stride somewhere around 50% of my height. And if we look at the angle that I'm inherently going to have on my lead leg blocking angle here, I'm going to be in a more knee flex position simply as a byproduct of my stride being shorter. If my stride is longer, if I lengthen that out a couple feet, you'll notice that my landing position is going to be in a more extended knee position. So I'm going to have a firmer blocking angle on the front knee. With a longer stride, a little bit more of a flexed knee position on a shorter stride. Now, one individual that I've gotten to know, Ryan Croton, has actually done research on stride length. And what he's found is that the blocking angle on shorter strides versus longer strides, again, supports what I just said. Athletes have a more knee flex position with shorter strides. Longer stride, they have a more knee extended position. Not only that, but the athletes with longer strides, they were able to actually create a better blocking pattern. So as they begin to rotate and actually put force into the ground, that knee actually was able to stabilize and continue to extend as they rotated. Whereas the athletes with shorter strides, as they began to rotate into that block, the knee flexion angle actually began to increase. They began to leak through the knee before ultimately blocking and extending that knee. So they had more of a soft knee with a shorter stride, and again, more of a firm lead leg blocking angle with a longer stride. Not only that, but if we actually look at more of his research on ground reaction forces and stride length, what they found is that the athletes with longer strides were able to put more horizontal ground reaction force into the ground. So they were able to create more horizontal force. The athletes with shorter strides, it was more of a vertical force. So again, this is obvious if we think about it. If you just have a very upright delivery the whole time, where is that force from the back leg going? It's going straight down into the ground. If you create a very lateral delivery, you do a really good job getting into your backside. Where is that force going? That force is being created in more of a horizontal direction. So they found that, but they also found, unsurprisingly, that the force then created through the lead leg block was also more horizontal. So this is what I'll refer to as like my inverted V idea. But basically, the guys with shorter strides, the back leg angle and the lead leg angle mirror each other, roughly. Longer strides, it also mirrors each other, but it's going to be more of a wider V. So it's like this position, shorter strides are more like this. But the idea is the deeper you can get into your back leg, the more effective of lead leg block you're going to be able to create. There's going to be a point where you get way too wide and it's just not effective. But again, point being, the lead leg and the back leg roughly mirror each other in terms of the blocking angle you're able to create. The other thing that Ryan Croton found in his research is that athletes with longer strides tend to also have more of a knee flexion angle. Now, I don't know if they looked at hip flexion angle as well, but the data that I saw showed knee flexion angle was greater in athletes with a longer stride. In other words, they had more sit into their back leg. They had more of a hinge into their backside to be able to ride that hinge, be able to ride the back leg into a longer stride. Athletes with shorter strides, unsurprisingly, had less of a sit on their back leg, and it was more of a tall and fall position. So again, that's pretty obvious, but again, reinforcing both the inverted V concept and also reinforcing the concept of riding out the hinge on the backside as long as possible that we've talked about in other videos. So now, why is it an issue when the stride is too long? Because a lot of coaches will say, get as far down the mound as you possibly can, stride long. Well, there is actually such a thing as too long. So I've marked actually down here on the mound, this far tape piece is actually 100% of my height, measured to the ankle. This close one is 75%. And so what you'll see is I really have to get out there to get to 100% if that's where my stride is. What happens if I try to stride 110%, 120% of my height? Well, you can see that when I'm in this extended position, there's really not a ton of room to rotate from. So your hip actually can't rotate as well when you're in this end range, hip abduction, extension, hip internal rotation position. You just don't have as much room to rotate from this position, either from below or from above. You just run out of room in the socket. You back that up just a little bit, and suddenly you actually have a lot of room to maneuver in the joint. So that's just the mechanics of the hip joint. You just run out of room to actually rotate when you're in this completely end range position of full extension. You can't rotate from that position. I would actually argue that's an injury risk factor for your hip labrum. Tim Lincecum, the guy, Trevor Bauer had issues with that. Myself, I've had issues with that from getting kind of overly extension dominant with my backside. So again, too long, you run out of room to actually rotate in the hip socket. The other thing that becomes an issue is what a lot of guys end up doing if they train towel drills and they're really just trying to get out there as far as they possibly can, is it forces you to have to become super linear and jump or push off the backside. So if I were trying to get out to 110, 120% of my height in a stride and artificially just bump that number up, there's really no effective strategy to rotate to get there. The only real way to get there is going to be to triple extend and jump my way down the mound to get as far as I possibly can. The problem with that is that's just simply not what the hardest throwers, that's not what the most efficient throwers in the world do. Pitching is a combination of both rotational and linear components. If we crank that linear component all the way up, there is a point where you can no longer actually turn that into efficient rotation and an efficient block. So you can think about this, let's look at pull downs for an example. Most of us can throw harder in a pull down than just throwing off the mound or just throwing off flat ground. Why? Because we're adding this linear momentum to the throw. But if you've ever done pull downs, you keep backing up, you start sprinting from across the facility, across the field.
That day, for no particular reason, I decided to go for a little run.
There's a point at which you actually stop throwing harder because it's actually too much linear. You actually can't block that, you can't capture that energy, and you can't actually convert it into rotation. So the linear component is only as valuable as what we can actually capture from that with our lead leg, with our rotation, and actually get its way up into the arm. This goes back to the idea of more ground reaction forces aren't necessarily better either. Why? Because what's the strategy that would create the highest ground reaction force reading into a force plate right here? It would be to push off as hard as I possibly could. That would be what gives me the highest ground reaction force reading. But that's not what the hardest throwers in the world do. They have high readings, but it's not the same as pushing aggressively into that rubber as hard as you possibly can, because that ends up sacrificing rotation, that ends up sacrificing your ability to actually capture that tornado of rotation and get that ground reaction force ultimately into the arm. And again, what I just described was an exaggerated version of that leaping action off the rubber. I really think about it as a spectrum where you have rotation on one side, linear on the other side. And if you get overly linear, you're leaping off the mound. But there are pitchers who have had very slight extension patterns, but still rotate pretty well. Tim Lincecum is a good example. Jonathan Gray is another guy who comes to mind, where they have a very slight hop off the rubber, but they still capture rotation pretty well. So think of it on a sliding spectrum where, again, super aggressive triple extension dominant pattern, very detrimental to rotation. Very slight, less detrimental to rotation. Overly rotational with no linear, also detrimental to velocity. Again, thinking of that Goldilocks zone, you're striding just far enough where you can actually capture that efficiently into rotation. So the American Sports Medicine Institute has actually studied this for years, and their range for elite professionals that they've studied in their motion capture lab is 77 to 87% of height. So that's what they would consider their ideal stride length based on their research. Again, they're testing pitchers in a lab setting. They're not necessarily throwing game velocities. They're not throwing in cleats, not on dirt. So take that for what it's worth, the 77 to 87% range, probably more like 80 to 90% if you actually go outside, put on cleats and game intensity. So again, that's the range that they've established. I went ahead and just kind of analyzed on video a couple of different pitchers just to see a rough gauge of where they might be at. Aroldis Chapman, Tim Lincecum, both in that 95 to 100% range, measured from the rubber to their lead ankle relative to their height. Emilio Pagan, another guy with a really long stride, also 95 to 100%. Zach Greinke, a guy who's kind of known for having a little bit of a shorter stride, he's more of that pure rotation guy, doesn't really have this linear move, doesn't really ride his backside down the mound that well. He's at 80%. So he would be a guy who's kind of on the very low end of the range that ASMI outlined, whereas Aroldis Chapman, Tim Lincecum, these guys are kind of off the charts as far as how long their strides are. So when looking at those ranges, if you fall a little bit above that range, the 87% range, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as it's a problem, because what we see is that the very hardest throwers in the world, a lot of them do fall just a little bit above that range. So kind of revising that, opening that range up just a little bit, I would say somewhere between 75% and 100% of your height. If you're way outside of either of those ends of the spectrum, there's probably an issue going on. If you're way below 75% of your height as far as stride length, you're definitely not capturing any linear component to your throw. And if you're over 100%, it's almost impossible to get that without having a very extension dominant pattern. Just because you're within the range, however, does not mean that your lower half is optimized. It doesn't mean you have the best pelvic loading strategy. And there are certainly lots of issues with most of our athletes that they can still work on even if they fall within that range. So in summary, my take would be that you shouldn't really be focusing on stride length as a main priority in your training and your throwing. It's more of a general indicator that you can look at to see, hey, am I in this broad range that high-level throwers fall in? If yes, it doesn't actually mean that you've optimized your mechanics. So I don't personally feel that pitchers should be actively focusing on stride length. I think it's really something that should take care of itself, but the focus should be on optimizing the actual pelvic loading strategy, optimizing how well you're able to hinge, how well you're able to drift with that forward move, how well you're able to rotate, how well you're able to block. And the stride length, again, kind of takes care of itself. So one helpful cue here is ride the hinge as long as you can down the mound while still being able to rotate out of that. So that's kind of how we'll explain it to our guys is, look, the focus is on the initial weight shift and then hinging, getting in a good loaded position and being able to ride the center of the body down the mound. If you get to a point where you're overextended, you're gonna lose the ability to actually rotate out of it. And if you get to the point where it's too short, then you're not actually capturing all that potential energy from the linear move. So there's an ideal range of being able to ride the backside. Garrett Cole is a great example of this, where you're able to optimize that linear and that rotational component. I'm gonna go ahead and link some videos down below on how to optimize this pelvic loading process. There's a ton of different drills, strategies, cues that we've covered on this channel before. If you guys aren't already following us on our social media channels, check us out on Twitter, check us out on Instagram. And if you have any questions specific to your situation, give us an email, contact@treadathletics.com. I'll see you guys in the next video.